What if a single football player could silence the sound of war? For 5 long years, the Ivory Coast was ripped apart, families divided, neighbors turned against each other, and a nation drowning in chaos. Politicians had failed, leaders had fallen silent, and hope seemed impossible. But then, in the middle of it all, one man stepped forward, not with weapons, not with power, but with a ball at his feet and a microphone in his hands. And in a moment the world would never forget, Didier Drogba spoke words that no one else dared to say, words that would change his country forever. At the dawn of the 2000s, Ivory Coast was a nation at war with itself. The once thriving country, known for its cocoa and coastal beauty, had fallen into chaos. In 2002, a civil conflict exploded, splitting the country into two. The North fell under the control of rebel forces, while the South remained loyal to the government. Entire families were divided by checkpoints and front lines. Travel became dangerous, schools closed, and the economy collapsed. Neighbors who once shared meals now looked at each other with suspicion. Fear replaced trust, and gunfire became the soundtrack of daily life. For 5 long years, attempts at peace failed. Politicians gave speeches, leaders met in endless talks, but the violence never truly stopped. The nation seemed locked in a cycle of despair. Yet, in the middle of that darkness, there was one thing that still managed to bring a flicker of unity: football. On the rare days when a national team played, rebels and government supporters alike would gather around radios and televisions. For 90 minutes, the sound of cheering drowned out the sound of guns. The team wasn't just playing for trophies. They were unknowingly carrying the weight of a divided nation on their shoulders. October 2005, the Ivory Coast national team had just made history by qualifying for their first ever World Cup. In the locker room, celebrations were wild, players jumping, shouting, and singing. But in the middle of that joy, Didier Drogba knew this victory meant more than football. Cameras rolled as he suddenly asked for silence. With his teammates standing behind him, Drogba spoke directly to his country.
Ivoiriens, Ivoiriennes, du Nord et du Sud, du Centre à l'Ouest. Vous avez vu, on vous a prouvé aujourd'hui que toute la Côte d'Ivoire peut cohabiter, peut jouer ensemble pour un même objectif, se qualifier pour le mondial. Vous nous avez promis que cette fête allait rassembler le peuple. Aujourd'hui, on vous demande, s'il vous plaît, on se met à genoux. Pardonnez. 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 Le seul pays de l'Afrique qui a toutes ses richesses ne peut pas sombrer dans la guerre comme ça. S'il vous plaît, déposez tous les armes. Faites les élections, organisez les élections et tout ira du mieux. On veut s'amuser. Arrêtez vos fusillades. On veut s'amuser. Arrêtez vos fusillades.
Men and women of Ivory Coast from the north, south, center, and west, we prove today that all Ivorians can live together. We beg you, on our knees, please forgive, please lay down your weapons. Then, he did something no politician dared to do. He dropped to his knees. A superstar, humbled before his people. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't polished, it was raw, desperate, and real. Millions of Ivorians watching at home froze. For a brief moment, it felt like the entire country was holding its breath. And in that silence, hope crept back into a nation that had almost forgotten what peace sounded like. The message spread faster than anyone imagined. Within hours, Drogba's speech was replayed across television screens, radio stations, and newspapers. His image, one of the most famous strikers in the world, kneeling on a locker room floor, became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the words. It was the sight of a superstar lowering himself in desperation, begging his people to choose peace. For Ivorians who had lived years surrounded by checkpoints, fear, and the constant echo of gunfire, it felt like a moment from another world. Politicians had promised peace before, generals had signed treaties, but nothing had worked. And yet, here was Didier Drogba, a man who represented pride, joy, and victory, speaking from the heart. He wasn't a government official. He wasn't part of the conflict. He was someone people actually trusted. The reaction was instant. Across neighborhoods, people who hadn't spoken in years gathered to listen. In rebel territory, leaders who had refused to negotiate suddenly sent messages of dialogue. In government strongholds, commanders admitted the fighting had to stop. In some towns, the sound of gunfire went quiet for the first time in years. Ivorians began to ask themselves, if our national team can play together, why can't we live together? Drogba had accomplished something extraordinary. He cracked open the door to peace. But he knew words alone would not be enough. To truly unite a divided country, he would have to take an even bigger risk, one that would push football beyond the pitch and straight into the heart of a war zone. Drogba knew his speech had lit a spark, but he wanted to turn that spark into something unforgettable. He pushed for something no one thought was possible, to play the national team's next home game not in the capital, not in safe territory, but in Buak, the rebel stronghold at the very heart of the conflict. At first, the idea sounded insane. Buak was a city scarred by war, a place where government troops and rebel fighters had faced each other for years. Moving a World Cup qualifier there meant risk, political, personal, even physical. But Drogba refused to back down. He convinced the authorities, and against all odds, the government and the rebels agreed. Football would go where politics could not. When the day came, the atmosphere was unlike anything Ivory Coast had ever seen. The stadium was packed. Rebels and loyalist soldiers, civilians from both north and south, all standing side by side. Armed men who had once aimed rifles at each other now shared songs, flags, and chants. For 90 minutes, the divisions disappeared. On the pitch, the elephants played like men possessed. Ivory Coast demolished Madagascar 5-0. Each goal felt like a release, a roar against the years of violence. Fans erupted, soldiers hugged civilians, and the chants of Ivory Coast, Ivory Coast, echoed louder than any weapon. That night, the match wasn't just about football. It was a miracle. A nation saw itself united in one stadium, if only for a moment. And for many Ivorians, it was the first time in 5 years they believed peace was possible again. The morning after the match in Buak, headlines across the country carried the same message. 5 goals to erase 5 years of war. It wasn't just a football result. It was a statement of unity. The image of government soldiers and rebel fighters sitting side by side in the stands, celebrating the same goals, became a symbol that Ivory Coast was still one nation. People spoke of that night as if it were a miracle. For the first time in years, Ivorians felt proud not just of their team, but of their country. The elephants had shown that it was possible to celebrate together, to share joy without fear, and to look beyond the lines that had divided them for so long. For Drogba, this wasn't about fame or even football anymore. He had become something more than a striker. He was a bridge, a figure people trusted in a time when trust was almost impossible to find. His influence reached beyond the pitch. He was invited into peace talks, celebrated in international media, and later named a goodwill ambassador by the United Nations. But for Ivorians, what mattered most wasn't his titles or recognition abroad. It was the feeling that, thanks to their number 11, peace no longer seemed like a dream. It felt possible. What happened in Buak proved something extraordinary. Sometimes, the power of a jersey is greater than the power of a uniform. Drogba's influence didn't end when the final whistle blew. He became the face of reconciliation in Ivory Coast, a constant reminder that unity was possible. Politicians began to invite him to the table during peace discussions, not as a leader with authority, but as a voice people actually believed in. Internationally, his story spread like wildfire. The world marveled at how a footballer, not a general, not a president, had managed to push his country closer to peace. In 2007, the United Nations appointed Drogba as a goodwill ambassador, cementing his status not just as a legend of the game, but as a humanitarian icon. Yet for Ivorians, the true legacy wasn't about awards or recognition abroad. It was about what they felt inside their own country. They could point to that locker room speech, to that night in Buak, and say, that was the moment everything changed. Drogba had given them more than goals. He had given them belief, the belief that peace could return and that their nation could heal. Didier Drogba will always be remembered as one of Africa's greatest strikers, a Champions League hero, a legend at Chelsea. But in Ivory Coast, his legacy goes far beyond football. With one heartfelt plea, he stopped the sound of guns. With one match, he brought a divided nation into the same stadium. And with his voice, he reminded millions that peace was still possible. This wasn't the story of a politician or a general. It was the story of an athlete who used his fame to give his people hope. A reminder that sometimes the greatest victories aren't measured in trophies or goals, but in lives changed. So never underestimate the power of one moment, one voice, or one act of courage. Didier Drogba didn't just score goals. He proved that football could stop a war.